Hey guys, welcome back to Maker's Corner. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to take your plain, boring, regular looking 3D prints, whoops, and make them look like wood. So if you're ready, let's get started. Alright, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's first talk about the things we're going to need. We'll need some filler primer. I'm using Rust-Oleum Automotive Filler Primer. You can find this pretty much anywhere, Walmart, Home Depot, Lowe's, really any hardware store. We're going to need some Krylon Kamar varnish. This is a little harder to find. I found some at Hobby Lobby, but you can also find it on Amazon as well. And then to paint the actual wood grain texture, we're going to need some alcohol inks. I'm using Tim Holtz alcohol inks, but you can use any brand you want. The colors that I chose for this particular project are caramel, ginger, and teak wood. Feel free to experiment with whatever colors you want. Really any shade of brown will work, so the sky's the limit. We're also going to need a chip brush. You don't need anything fancy. If you pay more than $1 to $1.50 for your chip brush, you've paid too much. The cheaper the chip brush, the better. Alright, so let's start this project off with some 3D printing time lapses. I printed this Raspberry Pi case on my Bambu Lab P1S, and I printed this cool Indian eagle sculpture on my Elegoo Saturn IV Ultra. Now, spoiler alert, I did make a few mistakes on this one later on in the video, but that's okay. As long as you learn from your mistakes, then you can see them as a learning experience rather than a failure. Once you have your parts printed, it's time to hit them with some Rust-Oleum Filler Primer. I did a pretty good job on the lid, but as you're going to see here in a second, I did not do so great on the top of the Raspberry Pi enclosure. It got way too thick, and I tried to fix it, but I just made things worse, so I ended up reprinting it and was a little bit more careful the second time around, just doing a couple really light coats. You really don't need a whole lot, you just need to get enough on there to make everything nice and smooth. That is the key to all this. Everything needs to be smooth. So whether you're doing this on a 3D print or anything else, smooth surfaces make things much easier. Now moving on to our resin print, because this was done on a SLA printer, it's already really smooth, so I just needed to put a super light coat of filler primer on there. It just kind of helps the whole overall effect. It's not technically necessary, but I do still recommend putting a really light coat on there just to even things out a little bit. Now, a little bit of a side note, if you're going to be 3D printing really highly detailed things like this and trying to paint a wood grain pattern on it, it really helps to have a resin printer due to the amount of detail they're capable of and the lack of layer lines. That being said, I know not everybody has a resin printer, and that's okay, because that's where today's sponsor, PCBWay, can help out. Whether you need something resin printed using one of their SLA printers, FDM printed using one of their many material options, or even metal 3D printed, PCBWay's got you covered. Simply upload your files, select the quantity and what kind of process and material you want, and let PCBWay handle the rest. They offer competitive prices and really fast shipping. No matter what your next project calls for, let the experts at PCBWay help you out. And of course, PCBWay offers more than just 3D printing. They offer custom PCBs, CNC milling, and laser cutting. So check them out at the link below. Thanks again PCBWay for sponsoring. Now back to the video. Once our filler primer was dry, it was time to start sanding. Now you do not need to go crazy with this, just a really light sanding. The filler primer is going to be pretty flat by itself. And then it's time to start painting. I'm not going crazy with this. I'm just putting a super thin coat of brown paint. This is the Rust-Oleum Nutmeg. I'm going to do the same thing for our resin print. And again, the filler primer underneath it really just helps it stick a little bit better. For whatever reason, resin prints and spray paint tend to be a little weird. Sometimes it sticks really well and sometimes it doesn't. So that thin coat of filler primer really just helps to make sure everything sticks properly. And now for the fun part. We finally get to start painting our wood grain. So I'm just putting a little bit of the alcohol ink on here and then just brushing in one direction. And as you can see, even after just a little bit with one single color, it's already starting to look a little bit like wood. Now there are really no rules to this, with the exception of trying to keep in one direction. You don't want to be brushing up and down or left and right and up and down and sideways. Try to keep your brush strokes going in one single direction. Once I've got a decent coverage on the top, I'm going to work on the sides a little bit because those are the most difficult parts. And again, I'm keeping my brush strokes on the sides going in the same direction. As you can see, I started adding a few more colors, and it's not looking horrible, but I really don't like the way it looks. Not a big deal, just keep adding more alcohol ink and keep brushing until you get something that you like. Okay, now this I really do not like. I'm stopping to show you guys because, look, mistakes happen and that's okay. Just keep going until you finally get something that you like, and pretty soon here, it's gonna start taking shape. It's been a really long time since I've done anything like this, so, you know, practice kind of makes perfect. Now here, I'm starting to get something that I'm liking a little bit. There's a few little things that need to be touched up, so I'm just going to grab a couple different colors of my alcohol inks and start mixing them again. Try and smooth out some of the rough edges. Alright, I'm actually really liking this now. Something to keep in mind is, for whatever reason, on the camera, it doesn't look as good as it does in person. In person, this really has a nice wood grain look. Once I was done with that, I decided to work on the top half of the Raspberry Pi case. This time I decided to start with a lighter shade of brown, and as you can see, even with just that single color, that's already got a somewhat convincing wood grain look to it. So I'm going to keep adding a little bit more, start mixing in some of the darker pigments to give it a little character, and before you know it, this thing is really going to start taking shape and looking like wood. Now, a little bit of a side note, I know there's a lot of time lapses going on here, which may make this seem like this is a really long process, but in actuality, this whole process only took me about 15 minutes. And there we go. I'm pretty darn happy with this. Again, I'm not really sure why, but this thing looks so much better in person than it does on camera. It's probably the lighting. I don't know. I'm not a cinematographer. Is that the right word? I don't know. And now for the really complicated one. This one, oh man, I made a lot of mistakes with this one. I didn't follow my own rule of going in one direction the entire time, which really hurt me on this one. In addition to that, the studio lighting that I was using really was not making it easy for me to see what everything looked like. There was quite a bit of glare, and so I was just kind of painting things quickly and randomly and praying for the best. Unfortunately, this piece ended up not only looking not so great on camera, but also not so great in person. Now don't get me wrong, it still looks pretty darn good, and it does still have a pretty convincing wood look in person, but on camera it just, I don't know, it looks a little rough. I'm going to try and get some beauty shots here at the end of the video to try and showcase what it looks like in person. And now for the final step. We want to protect all of our hard work, so this is where the Krylon Khmer varnish comes in play. We're just going to do a few light coats of this to really lock the alcohol ink in place. And there we have it. We've got our finished pieces here. This is the Raspberry Pi case. I decided to actually put one in there so we could see what it looks like, and I think it looks pretty darn good. And here's the Indian and Eagle sculpture. You know, it still looks a lot better in person than on camera, but even so, I think it still looks pretty darn good. Alright, well that's going to do it for today's video. Hope you guys learned something. I know I sure did, especially with all the little mistakes I made, but hey, that's what making is all about. Making and learning. The more you learn, the more you can make. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure to do so. I've got a really big project coming out next, and it's going to be an exciting one. So make sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.